In this video, we're going to be talking about my experience with the Tourbox editing console. Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to another Gear Short. This is Dylan Golby. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Tourbox editing console and how I feel about it after about 3 weeks of use. When it comes to post-production, I'm the kind of person who likes to work with tactile controls and only have the few things that I actually need to use at hand at any given time. So that's actually one of the primary reasons that I switched from Lightroom to Capture One, was the ability to customize that interface, put in the tools that you want and remove all of the ones that you don't. So Capture One does a pretty good job of that. You can sort of just pick and choose which pieces you actually need to use. If you don't need keystoning or say one of their various color controls, you can just simply remove it from the interface. But you still have to scroll up and down and, move the sliders back and forth with, say, a mouse, or more recently with their speed edit tools, which allows you to push a key and then scroll with the mouse wheel. Now those work pretty well and it does simplify the editing process, but I always like to work with something very tactile if I can. And so initially I actually purchased a Loupedeck Plus, and that was dedicated, well, it was sort of designed to work better with Lightroom than it was with Capture One, and most of that is to do with Capture One's API, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But I always found the Loupedeck, all the buttons were exactly the same size, all the dials were exactly the same size, and it was kind of difficult to find which one was which without looking at it. They also started to fail after a while, so now my exposure dial doesn't really go the way you want it to. If you turn it right, it currently goes left. My highlights dial does pretty much the same thing. It sort of decides which way it wants to go whenever you do it. Loupedeck software was, it was good if you were working with Lightroom or Photoshop. It wasn't great for Capture One. The customizability just wasn't there, and so a few other things with that. Just the overall build quality and the software didn't really lend itself to long-term use. So I'm yet to get to that point with the Tourbox, but so far it feels pretty good. So let's have a chat about that today. So full disclosure here, Tourbox did send this to me for review and I do get to keep it. They haven't paid me and they don't get to see this video before it goes live, so everything in this are my own thoughts. There are some positives and negatives, and as I said, I've only used it for a few weeks so far, so the overall longevity of this tool I can't really talk about. So on to my initial impressions. As I took this out of the box, the first thing I was struck by was just how heavy it is. It's quite small and you don't really expect it to be this sort of dense and weighty, but that is a really good thing, because once you put it on the desk, it doesn't really move around. It's got these nice little rubber feet on there, and so you can sort of, push the buttons, turn the dials, and it won't move on the desk, which is really, really good. So on to those buttons and dials. Now, the buttons all sound like those sort of old mouse buttons. So if you remember, in the 90s or the early 2000s, when you'd click a mouse, it had quite an audible click, basically. And these buttons, I don't know if you can hear these, I'll put them here. They all sound just like those old mouse buttons, which is great. It lets you know that you're pushing them. But compared to the dials, that does sound a little cheaper. The dials feel really good, really well made. The buttons feel really good, like they'll last a while, but they just have that that audible old school mouse click to them, which was a surprise. I kind of giggled the first time I did it. When it comes to the dials have a nice solid click, so you can hear here. Those have a much more solid click than the buttons. They do turn, and they have a little bit of resistance and some little notches, so you can sort of feel that you're turning them. There's not a lot of tactile feedback, but I do like that. I like the fact that you can just turn them and they will just keep spinning and spinning really easily, so you can make large adjustments, also small adjustments, and they do have a setting in the software for making softer adjustments as well, but we'll get to that in a moment. But I feel like everything on here is built really well and it does feel like it will last. The other thing that I immediately noticed was this thing is an absolute dust and fingerprint magnet. Now, I had a bit of a task to clean this to get a couple of product shots for it. I probably should have done those the moment I took it out of the box, but to get the shot that you see on the screen and the shot in this YouTube thumbnail, I got in there with a microfiber and gave it a really, really good rub. Now, during the course of that, I've probably pushed each of these buttons a couple of hundred times, so I'm probably not doing any favors for the life of the device, but I did want to clean it for you guys there. You'll see by the end of the video that it gets pretty grimy once you put your fingers on it. So if that's something that you're concerned about, maybe you'll have to invest in a couple of microfiber cloths. For me, it does the job. It gets a bit grimy, so what? The The final thing that I noticed when I took it out of the bag that I was really happy with is that the cable is not connected to it. This is not one of those sort of internal cables that if it breaks, you're going to have to go back to the manufacturer and give them a few dollars for repair and all of that. You can just swap out, it's a USB Type-C, so you can just swap it out. Maybe you don't like the length of the cable, swap it out for a shorter one. Maybe it breaks over time, you can swap it out for another one. Not to say that the cable they give you isn't of great quality. This is one of those sort of woven cables. It feels really good. This is not one of the cheap USB-C cables either. When you plug it in, it has a really solid click and it doesn't pop out. So really, really happy with that. Connecting the Tourbox is as simple as installing their software and plugging in the USB cable. So let's jump in and have a look at how we can set up the different buttons. Okay, so here we are in the Tourbox console, which is their software for setting up the different presets and the different ways that you can work with your software. So basically on this side you can create a little preset. You can have one for each application, and you can actually have auto switch here turned on, which will, if you switch from Photoshop to Lightroom, or Capture One to Lightroom or something like that, you can have it automatically switch all of these buttons to work specifically with that software. But since I only use Capture One, I only have one at the moment, and I've removed all of the included ones, which are Lightroom and Photoshop and Premiere and all of that. While I was experimenting, I did create a Capture One grading preset to see if I could make Capture One work really well with this. But as I'll talk about soon, there are a couple of limitations that prevented me from making a really good preset for that. So I've kept it there just in case I can, make it work in the future. So let's jump in and have a look at how you set things up. So when I first got in here, you can basically see that you've got turn the knob left, turn the knob right, and press the knob, which is great. That means that as you get in here and, turn or press this guy, you can have it perform certain actions. What I didn't see when I was initially setting up was this little down arrow here, which allows you to open up, and then basically you can have, press this button, and while it's being held, what does the knob do? Press this button while it's being held, what does the knob do? Initially I didn't see those, and I was trying to set this up with Capture One's speed edit, which unfortunately you can't just have long press of these and then use, say, the mouse scroll wheel to do different edits and things like that. They don't work together. You have to basically use these four presets here. So holding this one, what does it do? Holding this one, what does it do? And the one limitation, I guess, with that is with this dial here. So that's this button here. This one cannot actually be worked with any of the other buttons. So you basically only have two functions for that, which is spin it and press it. So it'd be really nice if we could get these functions to work with this dial as well. So I've got pretty much everything set up the way I want it in this preset, but let's, for the sake of example, set up a button to create a variant in Capture One. Now, in Capture One, a variant can be created by pressing F8 by default. So I'm going to assign this side button here to create a variant. So what we'll do is we'll click on that, and then I will, in this shortcut, you can basically tell it whether you want it to use Control-Alt-Shift or the Windows key in composite with this. So that can give you a lot of access to all sorts of different shortcuts. Even within Windows itself, you can basically have this thing control the entire OS. But what I will have it do is to create Control F8. So I'll put F8 on my keyboard here, and then I'll give this a name. So you can say create variant. And what this does, we'll see in a moment, is allows you to basically review and see what buttons will actually be doing without just having to look at, say, a string of different keys that are pushed. So as you can see here, this says create variant, and then when you mouse over it, it says F8. So it will tell you what the shortcut key is, but also a more user-friendly way of basically looking at how your buttons are set up. The one final thing you are going to want to do when you have a button like this that's been assigned to work with the different dials as well is you are going to want to turn on this option here, up. And what that basically does is it sends the command when the button is released. So if you've pushed it in and done some work on the dials and then release it, it will not trigger this function. But if you haven't done any work on the dials, it will trigger this function. So if you don't set that, basically every time you push that to work with one of the dials, you're going to start creating variants, which will be a little bit annoying. Now, once we jump into Capture One, you've got all of these different buttons set up, but you have no way to know. As you can see on the Tourbox, you've got no way to know what button does what. And so as you're sort of training your muscle memory, that can be a little bit difficult. So what I've done, they call this thing the tour button here. And if you push this, it actually pops up with all your current key assignments. And if you push the advanced button, oh, not the advanced button, sorry, the dials button, you actually get to see what each one of these different things will do. And it highlights the button to say, hey, look, this is the one you're currently viewing. So for example, here, if I push this button, and then I turn the scroll wheel here, I'll be increasing or decreasing structure, which is one of the things that I commonly do in my images. So as I was basically getting my muscle memory trained, this was a really, really useful thing. I probably don't need it assigned to that button anymore, and I can use that button for something else, but while I was learning it, that was super useful. So far I've really enjoyed working with the Tourbox, but it does have a couple of shortcomings and a couple of things that I feel like could be improved very simply to make it just that little bit better. The first thing would be to have a little wireless dongle here. Now I know Wacom has done this with some of their tablets, and you can just plug in a little wireless dongle. So much better on the road when you just don't have to worry about another cable. So you're working on a laptop in a hotel room or something like that, you can just click it on with the Wi-Fi there and start editing. The next thing would be to allow this dial to have button combinations as well. So for example, as you saw before, I can hit this button and then dial this guy to change my highlight settings in Capture One. I can hit it here and then change my my clarity using this, or I can just use this alone to change the white balance. Now, this one cannot be combined with any other buttons. Now, for example, in Capture One, if this could be combined with one of these other buttons, you could actually create a set or another preset for the Tourbox software to allow color grading. So with Capture One, you have a very easy way with the color balance tool to change the hue, saturation, and lightness of your shadow, midtone, and highlight areas. So it's a very powerful tool. And if you could, say, for example, assign this to go into that shadows tool and then change the hue, saturation, and lightness, would be super useful. Then you could go over here, do that with your midtones, and you could maybe program this guy here and do it with your highlights. So enabling this with the other buttons would just make that one tool in Capture One such an easier tool to use. A couple of other things that would make this really useful in Capture One would be the ability to do things like change the crop ratio or select a preset, but that's going to require the team at Capture One to actually develop their API a little bit better so that outside software can access it and get to those sort of functions in Capture One. When it comes down to it, you're actually buying a tool like this to improve the efficiency of your editing process. And so, is it actually any faster? Well, for me, it's definitely a lot faster than, say, using the mouse to pull sliders back and forth and having to find the tools that you want in the panels in Capture One. Is it going to be any faster than, say, Capture One's speed edits? Well, I don't think so. I think once you get your muscle memory dialed in for either tool, it's going to be really, really good. Capture One's speed edits do require you to be constantly using the scroll wheel on your mouse, so eventually you are going to wear that out. In the long run, spreading that wear out across multiple dials and buttons might be something that saves you money, but I don't think that's really a consideration that I'd be worried about. For me, it's just the way that I like to work, and with the Loupedeck, I found that I sped myself up quite a bit, and with this, I find the same thing. The tactile way of interacting with Capture One just works for me. Finally, let's talk about the experience of using the Tourbox versus the Loupedeck Plus. Now, I've had the Loupedeck Plus for a bit over a year now, and the things that I've found good about it have been, the tactile controls, the massive buttons that you have here, even though this is a little bit better for Lightroom because you do have good access to all the controls in there. The things that I haven't liked about it, the longevity of these buttons, my right arrow here sometimes just sticks and scrolls me through thousands of images. My exposure and my highlights dials, as I mentioned, don't really work that well anymore. I've also found that because these are all the same size and they're all kind of really close together, that as I go to reach for one, I do knock the others occasionally. And I've also found that, you have to look down constantly because there are so many dials to figure out which one you do want to use. So while it's a good device and it definitely sped things up, I have found the Tourbox to be a little bit more effective for the way that I work, which is pretty simple. And I don't like to look at the controls as I'm actually making changes. So when it comes to the toolbox, all these buttons are of a different size, so you can just sort of feel which one you're going to be touching. Because you can just feel which button you're touching, the ability to just keep working without actually looking at this is great. And once the muscle memory kicks in, it did take me a little while to get used to, but once the muscle memory does kick in, you can just keep working on your images without even looking here. The final thing about this is the software does allow for just so much customization. You know, you can do a press of these two buttons, you can do a double click on a certain button, and all of those will send different messages to the computer. And so I think you have something like 40 or 50 functions that you can assign to this, and I haven't even begun to scratch the surface of that, but it does everything that I need to do with just a few quick button presses. To give you guys an idea of what it's like to work with this, let's jump into Capture One now and just edit a few images. So I have this set of 5 images here, which I'll scroll through now for you. And I've applied a simple preset to each one of these because you can't actually access presets using the Capture One current API or any keyboard shortcuts, so they can't be assigned to the toolbox. So I've got those set already. So let's go through, and basically what I would do here is I would use my right arrow and I would go through, and this guy I have set to flag images, so flag them green for me. So I would go through and say, yes, I want that one, 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 yes, I want that one. Now let's say I make a mistake and I want to go back. I can use this guy, and then the button next to it will actually turn the flag off. So the other one that I have set up, I currently use green as I go through for my first cull for, say, a big set of 1,000 images or something like that. And that's just going by feel, like, do I like this, do I like this, do I like this? And then later on I'll go back through and do a second cull. And when I do that, I remove all but the best one and put those as blue. So what I will do is then press this guy, which changes the flag to blue. So basically I have flag green, flag blue, and remove flags. So that's basically all I use when I'm culling. It can be done really quickly and easily using the toolbox. So let's go back to the first image and give it a quick edit. So the first thing that I notice here is that this is a little bit cool. So I'm going to jump in there and just quickly warm it up a little bit. I'm going to say around about there is good. Now if you look in these highlight areas here, the rocks are a little bit magenta, so I'm going to pull a little bit of that magenta out, maybe about there, seeing as we do have a lot of foliage reflecting on those. Now one thing that I normally like to do is add a little bit of magenta to those shadows in areas like this just to boost the contrast a little bit, but with this current setup we can only use these two dials in composite with other buttons, so we can't really do a full color grade with all 3 dials, so I'd like to see that hopefully in the updated software if that's possible. So a couple more things on here. I'm going to reduce the highlights here. So I'm just going to hold this guy and bring those highlights down. Just kills a little bit of the brightness on these rocks here. And maybe I'll raise the shadows a little bit just to reduce that contrast. So I'm going to grab this guy and just pull those shadows up a little bit. And finally, I might add a little bit of clarity. So I'll hold this guy again and use this dial here just to increase clarity a little bit. Maybe reduce those highlights a little more now. And so there you have it, a full edit done really, really quickly. So over to the next image. Now, for this one, I'm going to reduce the exposure a little bit. So I've got exposure set to this dial. So let's pull that down a little bit. Probably there is good. And then let's reduce our highlights a little bit just to bring that sky back in a little bit. As you can see, those clouds come back in. And perhaps maybe we'll add some shadow detailing just to bring out the underside of those roofs a little bit. Now, here comes in again something that I would normally like to do, which is a little bit of dodging and burning. Now, that's where you're going to have to switch over to the mouse and keyboard again, because it's just a little bit difficult to move the mouse around with things like the buttons that are available here. So your basic edits are going to get done really, really quickly on this, but then you are going to have to use another tool, maybe a tablet or a mouse and keyboard to be able to do your dodging and burning here. So for this next one, we're going to skip over. I'm going to do this guy first. So because we've got a little bit more sky in this image, so it's a bit easier to see. Okay, so again, I think the first thing we want to do here is warm up the image a little bit. I feel like it's a little bit cool, so let's pull that up to around about 5,500 Kelvin. That looks pretty good. And then the next thing that I'm going to do is bring the tint down a little bit. The tops of those roofs are a little bit magenta for my taste. And then what we'll do is we'll increase our exposure a little bit, just bring a little bit more life into this, and maybe increase the contrast just a little bit. Actually, you know what, now let's decrease that contrast a little bit. Let's go down, there we go. Gives it a bit more of a softness like it felt on that day. And now I'll bring down the highlights again to just bring that sky back in a little bit. So we'll go down to around about here, just so it doesn't look too fake. There we go. And then I'll raise those shadows just a little bit like that. You might add a little bit of clarity to this just to bring in that mid-tone contrast again. And again, the next thing I would do here would be a little bit of dodging and burning. So I might burn this rock here, burn these stairs, burn all these little fences here, do a little bit of a dodge under these roofs, just bring the focus into this area a little bit. However, the thing that I want to show you here is just how very simple and easy it is to copy and paste adjustments. So rather than using the mouse to do this, I've just got my up arrow here set to copy, and then I'll go back to the previous image and go down arrow, which pastes them onto that. And now we have two identical images, or two identical edits, sorry. Okay, so let's move on to this last image. Now, this one was shot at the end of day on a fairly overcast day, but the sun was just sort of peeking through the clouds, so I want to give this a bit more of a warm feel. So let's go up in the Kelvin temperature to around about there. Take a little bit of that magenta out just to give it a bit more of a warm feel. And then from there, we'll raise the exposure a little bit, I think, and maybe, you know, these bricks here are getting a little bit bright, so let's bring down the highlights a little bit there, and then perhaps add a little bit of clarity just to give these a bit of pop against the building in the background. So there you have it, 5 quick edits with the Tourbox. That's been the Tourbox editing console and my experience with it in Capture One. Now, I don't really use Photoshop very often and I don't use Lightroom anymore, so I can't really answer too many questions about how those function. But if you do have any questions about how it functions in Capture One or how it functions overall, do let me know in the comments. I'll be happy to try and answer them for you. Now, Tourbox have given me a discount code for you guys, so you can find that in the description below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.